By the early morning of 13th of June 1886, the mountain air above Hohenschwangau, near Füssen in southern Bavaria, was cold enough to mist the stone of Neuschwanstein. In the king's neo-Gothic bedroom, a silver-plated swan-shaped washstand catches the first gray light, its polished neck and wings reflecting a room carved over 4.5 years by master woodcarvers. Outside, commissioners and doctors wait in carriages on the steep road, carrying the documents that will declare Ludwig II of Bavaria unfit to rule. 27 years earlier, in 1869, the foundation stone for this new Hohenschwangau Castle, designed by architect Eduard Riedel from Christian Jank's Romantic drawings, had been laid on this same ridge, a project the king once praised in a letter as a holy and unapproachable refuge. Now, behind Romanesque arches and painted legends, unpaid debts and whispered diagnoses press against the walls. The swan, emblem of purity, stands motionless on its basin. It will remain when its owner is gone. The Alpsee lies still in the valley below Hohenschwangau. On an autumn afternoon in 1858, its surface mirroring the limestone peaks that rise above the forests of southern Bavaria. On the slopes above the lake, a boy of 13 climbs the path toward the ruins of Vorder and Hinter Hohenschwangau, two medieval fortresses that had guarded the trade route centuries earlier before crumbling into picturesque decay. The wind carries the faint sound of cowbells from the pastures, and the air smells of damp moss and lichen growing thick on the broken walls. Prince Ludwig, heir to the Bavarian throne, pauses at the half-collapsed gatehouse, looking up at the jagged stones silhouetted against the sky. Behind him, down the slope, stands his father's castle, Hohenschwangau, rebuilt by King Maximilian II from another set of ruins in the 1830s and 1840s, its neo-Gothic walls painted inside with legends of medieval knights and swan-born heroes. Ludwig had grown up inside those painted rooms. The murals depicted Lohengrin, the swan knight of Germanic legend, arriving in a boat drawn by a white swan to rescue a maiden in distress. Other panels showed the knight's mysterious departure, his true identity revealed, and his oath broken, the swan pulling the boat back into the mists. The images had sunk deep into the young prince's imagination, merging history with fantasy until the two became indistinguishable. For Ludwig, the medieval world was not a distant past to be studied in books, but a living presence, more real and more desirable than the constitutional monarchy his father administered with careful pragmatism. The ruins above the lake taught a different lesson. Vorder and Hinter Hohenschwangau had once been strongholds of the Knights of Schwangau, minor lords who held this corner of Bavaria in the 12th and 13th centuries. By the 16th century, the castles were already abandoned, their walls cracking, their roofs collapsing. By the time Ludwig climbed the path in the 1850s, little remained but foundations, scattered stones, and the outline of towers against the rock. History has fallen here once already. That made it, in Ludwig's mind, the perfect place to rebuild it, not as it had been, but as it should have been, purified of compromise and decay. He carried a sketchbook on these walks, filling it with drawings of imagined towers, pointed arches, and battlements that never existed. Later biographers would find references in his letters and diaries to Falkenstein, wild, romantic, and other high remote sites where castles might rise. The attraction was not strategic. Ludwig did not think in terms of defense or administration. He thought in terms of theater, of myth made visible, of spaces where he could inhabit the roles he had absorbed from the painted walls of his childhood. The ruined hill above Hohenschwangau became, in his imagination, a blank page, a site where architecture could serve not power, but dream. The cultural context mattered. In the mid-19th century, Bavaria was caught between its own identity and the gravitational pull of Prussia. Maximilian II had attempted to position Bavaria as a cultural counterweight to Prussian militarism, supporting scholars, artists, and historians who could anchor Bavarian pride in a distinct heritage. But the political realities were harder to control. The German Confederation, established after the Napoleonic Wars, was fracturing under the pressure of competing national visions. Ludwig's childhood unfolded against this backdrop of shifting borders and uncertain futures, where the idea of kingship itself was being redefined by parliaments, newspapers, and the rise of industrial capitalism. For the boy on the ruined hill, these political tensions were abstractions. What he saw was simpler and more seductive: stone, sky, and the possibility of making something permanent out of a world that seemed increasingly transient. The wind that moved through the broken walls carried no sound of parliamentary debate or ministerial compromise. It was clean, cold, and empty, a silence waiting to be filled with something other than history. Records later showed that Ludwig returned to the site repeatedly throughout his adolescence, even as his father's health declined and the prospect of his own accession drew closer. The ruins remained, but in his mind they were already transforming into something else: a fortress, a sanctuary, a stage for a life that would be lived according to different rules. The stones did not yet know what weight they would be asked to bear. The hill did not yet know how much gold would be poured into its foundations, or how quickly the dream built on top of it would crack under the pressure of debts, diagnoses, and the cold logic of constitutional monarchy. In the photographs that survive from this period, Ludwig appears as a handsome, serious youth, his gaze often fixed on something beyond the camera's frame. The Alpsee reflects the sky. The ruins hold their silence, and the future king imagines a palace where history will not be allowed to fall again, where myth, once made solid in stone, will stand forever against the encroachment of time. In the spring of 1864, Ludwig ascended the Bavarian throne at the age of 18, following the sudden death of his father, Maximilian II. The young king inherited a kingdom caught between tradition and modernity, a constitutional monarchy where real power increasingly rested with ministers and parliaments rather than the crown. Bavaria had avoided the revolutions of 1848 without fundamental reform, preserving the outward forms of absolute rule while quietly accepting the limits imposed by a written constitution. Ludwig understood none of this particularly well and cared for it even less. What he cared about was Richard Wagner. The composer had been living in exile and debt, his operas championed by a small circle of devotees, but dismissed by much of the musical establishment as overwrought, unplayable, and financially ruinous. Ludwig, who had heard Lohengrin as a teenager and wept at the transformation of legend into music, summoned Wagner to Munich within weeks of his accession. The king would become the composer's patron, funding new productions, paying off old debts, and dreaming of a festival theater where Wagner's vision of a total artwork, Gesamtkunstwerk, could be realized without compromise. This was Ludwig's first great project, and it was also his first great failure. Munich's political establishment viewed Wagner with suspicion, seeing him as a foreign agitator with expensive tastes and dangerous Republican sympathies from his involvement in the Dresden Uprising of 1849. The composer's affair with Cosima von Bülow, wife of the conductor Hans von Bülow, became a public scandal. By 1865, under pressure from his ministers, Ludwig was forced to ask Wagner to leave Bavaria. The composer departed for Switzerland. The king remained in Munich, isolated, humiliated, and increasingly convinced that the world of politics and compromise was a trap he needed to escape. It was in this context, between 1866 and 1868, that Ludwig began to translate his childhood dreams of the ruined hill into architectural plans. He turned not to established court architects, but to Christian Jank, a stage designer who had worked on Wagner's operas. Jank understood theater, illusion, and the power of the picturesque. The sketches he produced were not architectural drawings in any conventional sense. They were romantic visions. A medieval castle perched on a cliff above the Paulat Gorge, its towers rising asymmetrically against the Alps, its walls glowing white above the dark forests, its silhouette evoking the legendary castles of Arthurian romance and Germanic epic. These drawings circulated in the Munich court, admired for their aesthetic appeal, but viewed with skepticism by anyone who understood the practical realities of construction. Jank's designs showed towers without proper foundations, walls that would require massive stone volumes, and decorative elements that belonged to theater sets rather than permanent buildings. The estimated costs, even in these early stages, were alarming. But Ludwig was entranced. In a letter to Wagner written around 1868, he described the site above Hohenschwangau as one of the most beautiful to be found, holy and unapproachable, a worthy temple for the composer's art. The description reveals Ludwig's intentions. This was not to be a residence in any ordinary sense. It was to be a temple, a shrine, a space consecrated to the ideals embodied in Wagner's music dramas, the triumph of purity over corruption, the endurance of myth over history, the possibility of a world governed by beauty rather than compromise. The king envisioned a great singers' hall modeled on the Wartburg, the medieval castle where Wagner's opera Tannhäuser was set. He envisioned a throne hall designed like a Byzantine basilica, a space of sacred kingship removed from parliamentary oversight. He envisioned a bedroom decorated with swan motifs, where the legend of Lohengrin would surround him even in sleep. To make Jank's visions buildable, Ludwig turned to Eduard Riedel, a court architect with experience in neo-Romanesque design. Riedel understood how to translate romantic sketches into load-bearing walls, how to engineer foundations on steep slopes, and how to balance aesthetic ambition with structural necessity. Over the course of 1868 and 1869, Riedel transformed Jank's stage designs into detailed architectural plans. The castle would rise on the site of the old Hohenschwangau ruins, its foundations blasted into the rock, its walls built from local limestone and sandstone. The design called for more than 200 rooms, though even at this early stage it was understood that only a fraction would be completed in the king's lifetime. The architectural drawings that survive from this period show a building caught between eras. The exterior would be medieval in appearance, pointed arches, defensive towers, crenellated parapets, but the interior would incorporate the most advanced technologies of the 19th century. Plans included central heating, running water on multiple floors, electric bell systems for summoning servants, and even a telephone line connecting the castle to the valley below. There would be no knights defending these walls. There would be no sieges to withstand. The medieval silhouette was not functional but symbolic, a rejection of the industrial age built using industrial means. On 5th September 1869, the foundation stone was laid on the ridge above Hohenschwangau. No grand ceremony marked the occasion. Ludwig preferred private rituals to public spectacles. The medieval ruins were demolished, their stones carted away or incorporated into the new foundations. Wooden scaffolding began to rise against the sky, and the sound of hammers and chisels echoed across the valley. Workmen arrived from Munich and the surrounding villages. Quarrymen prepared limestone blocks, and engineers measured and remeasured the slope to ensure the walls would not shift. The king visited frequently during the early construction, climbing the steep path to inspect the progress, consulting with Riedel over details of window placement and tower height. His enthusiasm was genuine, his knowledge of medieval architecture surprisingly detailed. But he was also increasingly absent from Munich, avoiding cabinet meetings, ignoring ministers' requests for audiences, and retreating into a private world where architecture, music, and legend mattered more than taxes, treaties, or constitutional obligations. In an age moving toward iron and industry, Ludwig committed himself to a past of stone and song. The commitment was not naive. He knew he was building against the grain of his century. He simply believed that the grain of his century was wrong, that modernity's emphasis on efficiency, profit, and parliamentary procedure had drained life of beauty and meaning. Neuschwanstein would be his answer, a space where time moved differently, where myth was not a memory but a present reality, where a king could be something other than a constitutional figurehead. The plans already exceeded the hill. Soon they would exceed his finances. But in 1869, as the first foundations were poured and the scaffolding climbed higher against the Alps, those consequences still lay ahead, hidden in account books not yet written. The ridge above Hohenschwangau, in the winter of 1870, is a construction site unlike any in Bavaria. The medieval ruins of Hohenschwangau have been cleared away, their stones sorted and stacked or crushed for fill. In their place, wooden scaffolding rises 3 stories high, braced against the wind that funnels through the Polet Gorge. Steam-driven cranes hoist limestone blocks cut from quarries near Füssen, each stone numbered and fitted according to Eduard Riedel's meticulous plans. The air smells of wet mortar, sawdust, and coal smoke from the machinery. When fog rolls in from the valley, as it often does in the early morning, the scaffolding disappears into white silence, and the only sounds are the distant thud of hammers and the creak of wooden beams under load. Construction began in earnest in 1869, immediately after the foundation stone ceremony. The first task was to prepare the bedrock itself. The ridge was not level, and the medieval foundations that remained were too weak to support the scale of building Ludwig envisioned. Engineers drilled into the limestone, set charges, and blasted away tons of rock to create a platform. The cellars and substructures were completed by 1872, carved partially into the living stone of the mountain. These lower levels would house storage rooms, servants' quarters, and the machinery for heating and water supply, and invisible infrastructure supporting the visible fantasy above. The construction accounts preserved in Bavarian state archives document the scale of the operation. Local quarries provided white limestone for the exterior walls, giving the castle its distinctive pale appearance. Red sandstone from Schleitdorf, over 100 kilometers to the north, was transported by rail and wagon for use in decorative elements, door frames, window surrounds, and the carved capitals of columns. Brick was used extensively for interior walls and load-bearing cores, hidden behind stone facings and plaster. The combination of materials was typical of 19th-century historicist architecture, which prioritized visual effect over material honesty. What mattered was not whether the walls were solid stone, but whether they looked as if they could have been built in the 13th century. By 1874, the gatehouse was rising above the access road, its portal framed in sandstone, its walls pierced with narrow windows evoking medieval arrow slits. Eduard Riedel supervised the work until that year, when he was replaced by Georg von Dollmann. The reasons for Riedel's departure are not entirely clear from surviving records. Some sources suggest disagreements over costs, others point to Ludwig's dissatisfaction with the slow pace of construction. Dollmann brought a different sensibility to the project, more attuned to Ludwig's increasingly elaborate interior ambitions. Under his direction, the focus shifted from structural completion to decorative intensity. The years from 1874 to 1876 saw the castle begin to take a recognizable form. The walls of the main residential wing rose floor by floor, scaffolding climbing higher each season. The towers began to emerge, the slender gatehouse tower, the larger residential tower, and the planned but never built central keep that would have soared 90 meters above the courtyard. Inside the shell, carpenters framed rooms, plasterers covered brick walls with smooth white surfaces, and masons laid the flagstone floors that would carry the weight of carved furniture and embroidered textiles. The sensory experience of the site during these years was one of controlled chaos. The sound of iron chisels striking stone echoed from dawn until dusk, punctuated by the hiss of steam engines and the shouts of foremen directing teams of workers. The smell of wet mortar mixed with the scent of fresh-cut timber and the acrid tang of coal smoke. In winter, the site was often shrouded in fog, the scaffolding vanishing into white stillness, icicles hanging from wooden beams. In summer, dust rose from the quarried stone, and the heat made the work slower, the lime mortar setting too quickly in the sun. Ludwig visited regularly, climbing the steep path from Hohenschwangau to inspect the progress. Contemporary accounts describe him walking through the half-finished rooms, tracing the outlines of future windows with his hand, asking questions about vaulting techniques and stone carving. He brought architectural books with him, pointing to illustrations of Romanesque churches and medieval castles, demanding that specific details be replicated. His knowledge was genuine, but filtered through a romantic lens. He cared less about structural integrity than about whether a space would evoke the atmosphere of a Wagner opera or a medieval legend. The technological modernity hidden within the medieval shell became increasingly apparent as construction progressed. Plans called for a hot air central heating system with furnaces in the cellar sending warmed air through ducts to all inhabited rooms, a luxury in the 1870s, even in royal residences. Running water would be supplied by a system drawing from a spring higher up the mountain, with pipes delivering water to multiple floors. An electric bell system would allow the king to summon servants without shouting or leaving his rooms. These were cutting-edge technologies, incorporated into a building designed to look as if it had been constructed 5 centuries earlier. The contradiction was not accidental. Ludwig understood that he was living in the 19th century. He simply refused to accept the 19th century's aesthetic and spiritual premises. The medieval appearance of Neuschwanstein was a deliberate rejection of industrial architecture, of the iron and glass exhibition halls and railway stations that symbolized modernity. But the comfort and convenience of modern technology were too valuable to abandon. The result was a building that embodied its creator's split consciousness, a medieval king ruling a constitutional monarchy, a romantic dreamer served by steam engines and electric wires. By 1876, the lower floors of the residential wing were habitable, though far from finished. The gatehouse was complete, its tower rising above the access road, its vaulted passage leading into the courtyard where foundations for the central keep lay open to the sky. The outer walls stood to their full height in some sections, their white limestone glowing in the alpine light. But vast stretches of the interior remained raw brick and exposed timber, rooms sketched in plaster and wood but not yet carved into their final forms. The hill that once held ruins now held scaffolds, an empire of wood and iron temporarily taller than the castle itself. From the valley below, Neuschwanstein appeared already complete, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the mountains. But anyone who climbed the path and entered the courtyard could see the gap between appearance and reality. The facade was finished. The interior was barely begun. Ludwig, who had dreamed of a palace completed in 5 years, was beginning to understand that his vision would take decades to realize, if indeed it could be realized at all. Yet the higher Neuschwanstein rose, the further Ludwig withdrew from the world it overlooked, retreating into the very isolation the castle was designed to embody. In the autumn of 1880, Ludwig II spent his first night in Neuschwanstein, though only a fraction of the palace was finished. The king's bedroom on the 3rd floor of the residential wing is complete, its walls covered in oak paneling carved over 4.5 years by master woodcarvers from Munich, each panel depicting scenes from the Tristan legend. The ceiling shows stars against a dark blue field, evoking the night sky under which the medieval lovers met. Heavy blue silk curtains embroidered with the Bavarian coat of arms, lions, lozenges, and swans hang at the windows and around the canopied bed. In one corner stands the silver-plated washstand shaped like a swan, its graceful neck curved, its wings slightly spread, water flowing from a hidden reservoir in its base into a marble basin below. The swan appears everywhere in this room. It is embroidered on the curtains, carved into the wooden panels, cast into the metalwork of the candelabra. The Swan of Lohengrin, the Swan Knight of Wagner's opera and medieval legend, the mysterious hero who arrives to rescue the innocent, bound by an oath never to reveal his true name, departing forever when the question is asked. For Ludwig, the swan is not merely decorative, it is a symbol of purity, of divine mission, of a nobility that cannot survive in the compromised world of ordinary humanity. He has surrounded himself with swans because he understands himself to be in some essential way like them, beautiful, solitary, and fated to leave a world that cannot comprehend or accommodate him. Beyond the king's bedroom, the palace is a labyrinth of completion and absence. The throne hall, occupying 2 full stories in the west wing, is structurally finished but not yet furnished. The vast space stretches nearly 14 meters high, its apse designed to hold a throne that will never be commissioned. The walls are covered in Byzantine-inspired mosaics depicting Christian kings and saints, their gold leaf catching the light from gas lamps and a massive chandelier suspended from the coffered ceiling. The floor is paved in over 2 million mosaic tiles, arranged in intricate geometric patterns. But the hall is empty. No throne sits on the raised dais, no courtiers gather on the gleaming floor. The space was designed for a vision of sacred kingship, Ludwig as a new Constantine ruling by divine right, but even the king himself rarely enters it. The Singers' Hall on the fourth floor is likewise complete in structure, but largely unfurnished when Ludwig first stays overnight in 1880. The hall runs the entire length of the east wing, inspired by Wartburg's Sängersaal, where Wagner set the singing contest in Tannhäuser. The walls are painted with scenes from Parsifal, the Grail legend, and other Wagnerian sources. The wooden ceiling is elaborately carved, the windows look out over the Alpsee and the valley below. But the hall is silent. No singers perform here, no contests of poetry or song fill the space. It is a stage without actors, a theater without an audience. Construction continues around the king even as he inhabits these completed rooms. Carpenters work in unfinished corridors, plasterers cover brick walls, painters climb scaffolding to apply the final details to ceiling murals. The sound of hammers and saws echoes through the palace, muffled by thick stone walls but never entirely absent. The smell of fresh paint, wet plaster, and sawdust mingles with the scent of beeswax candles and the oil lamps that provide light after dark. Ludwig moves through this half-finished world like a ghost in his own dream, occupying rooms that exist while corridors around them remain brick skeletons. By 1881, the king began to spend more time at Neuschwanstein, though he never established it as a primary residence. He prefers to arrive after dark and leave before dawn, reversing the normal rhythms of royal life. Servants learn to adjust their schedules to his nocturnal habits. Dinner is served at midnight. The king wanders the Singers' Hall alone in the early hours of the morning, his footsteps echoing under the carved ceiling, his shadow stretching long across the painted walls. Sometimes he summons musicians to perform, but more often he walks in silence, inhabiting a space designed for ceremony and pageantry, but used instead for solitary contemplation. The palace incorporates technologies that were cutting edge in the 1880s. The telephone line connecting Neuschwanstein to the valley is one of the earliest private phone installations in Bavaria. The electric bell system allows Ludwig to summon servants from any room without leaving his quarters, a small but significant departure from the rituals of traditional court life, where a king's movements were always attended and observed. The central heating system, still rare in the 1880s even in wealthy households, keeps the inhabited rooms warm through the alpine winter, though many corridors and unfinished spaces remain unheated. Yet these modern conveniences serve a deeply anti-modern purpose. Ludwig uses technology to increase his isolation, to reduce human contact, to create a self-sufficient world where he can live according to his own rhythms without interference. The telephone allows him to issue instructions without face-to-face meetings. The electric bells allow him to summon and dismiss servants without extended conversation. The layout of the palace itself, with the royal apartments separated from service areas by long corridors and multiple staircases, ensures that he can move through his private spaces without encountering staff unless he chooses to. Georg von Dahlmann, who has overseen construction since 1874, was dismissed in 1884 after a disagreement whose precise nature is unclear from surviving records. Some sources suggest Ludwig found Dahlmann insufficiently attentive to decorative detail. Others hint at conflicts over costs and construction. Timelines. Julius Hofmann replaces him, assuming leadership of a project that is now in its 15th year and still far from complete. Hofmann will oversee much of the interior decorative work in the final inhabited rooms, including the completion of the Singers' Hall and the ongoing refinement of the king's personal apartments. The palace administration records from the mid-1880s document a building caught between completion and incompletion. Out of more than 200 planned rooms, only about 14 or 15 are finished to the level Ludwig demands. The rest exist in varying states of development, some plastered but not painted, some framed but not plastered, some existing only as empty spaces within the brick structural core. The central keep, which was to have been the palace's tallest structure and to have contained a chapel, is never built beyond foundation level. The courtyard remains open to the sky where the keep was planned, a permanent absence at the heart of the complex. Financial pressures are mounting, though they do not yet constitute a crisis. The construction costs for Neuschwanstein, according to figures published in 1968 based on archival research, totaled about 6.2 million marks by 1886. This was an extraordinary sum for a private residence, equivalent to several times the king's annual civil list income. The money came not from the Bavarian state treasury, but from Ludwig's personal funds and from increasingly complex arrangements of loans and debt conversions negotiated by his finance ministers. But the loans carried interest, and the interest compounded, and by the mid-1880s it was becoming clear that Ludwig's income, even supplemented by borrowing, could not sustain both the completion of Neuschwanstein and the other projects he was simultaneously pursuing at Linderhof and Herrenchiemsee. In an age of parliaments and newspapers, he staged kingship as a private liturgy above the clouds. The throne hall without a throne, the singer's hall without singers, the bedroom where he slept alone surrounded by swans. These were spaces designed for rituals that existed only in Ludwig's imagination, or in Wagner's operas, or in medieval legends that had never been historical realities in the first place. Down in Munich, his ministers were reading not operas, but balance sheets, and what they read there alarmed them. The ledgers from 1882 to 1885, preserved in Bavarian state archives, tell a story of accelerating debt. Ludwig's civil list, the annual income provided to the monarch for personal and household expenses, amounts to roughly 4 million marks per year, a substantial sum by the standards of the 1880s. But the king is simultaneously financing three major palace projects: Neuschwanstein, still unfinished after more than a decade; Linderhof, a Rococo fantasy in the mountains near Oberammergau; and Herrenchiemsee, a vast replica of Versailles on an island in the Chiemsee. Together, these projects consume far more than his income can support. The costs of Neuschwanstein alone have exceeded early estimates by orders of magnitude. Christian Jank's romantic sketches from the late 1860s suggested a relatively modest castle, perhaps comparable to the rebuilt Hohenschwangau below. But as Ludwig's ambitions expanded, so did the scope and expense of construction. The throne hall required specialized craftsmen from Munich and Italy to create its Byzantine mosaics and gold leaf decorations. The carved woodwork in the king's bedroom took 4.5 years of continuous labor by master carvers. The singer's hall demanded elaborate murals covering hundreds of square meters of wall space. Each decorative program required artists, materials, and time, all of which had to be paid for. By 1883, Ludwig's debts had reached approximately 14 million marks, more than 3 times his annual income. The figure includes obligations from all his building projects, not just Neuschwanstein, but the castle on the ridge above Hohenschwangau represents the largest single expense and the most visible symbol of the king's financial overreach. Finance Minister Emil von Riedel negotiates increasingly complex debt conversions and loan extensions, moving money between accounts, deferring payments to contractors, and seeking new sources of credit. But the fundamental problem remains. Ludwig is spending money he does not have on buildings that generate no income and serve no public function. The financial structure is important to understand. Ludwig's construction projects are not funded directly from the Bavarian state treasury. Constitutionally, the king's civil list is his private income, and he is free to spend it as he chooses. The debts he accumulates are technically personal debts, not state obligations. But the distinction is more formal than real. Ludwig is not merely a private individual, he is the king of Bavaria, and his financial difficulties threaten the stability and reputation of the monarchy itself. If creditors move to seize assets or force the sale of properties, the scandal would damage not just Ludwig personally, but the institution of Bavarian kingship. Ministers and advisors attempt repeatedly to convince Ludwig to reduce spending, to halt construction, to live within his means. The king ignores them. In his view, the palaces are not luxuries, but necessities, sacred spaces where he can fulfill his true role as a patron of art and as a preserver of beauty in an age increasingly dominated by industrial capitalism and political compromise. To stop building would be to surrender to the values of a world he rejects. The ministers see balance sheets, Ludwig sees temples. The contrast appears starkly in the physical spaces of Neuschwanstein itself. In the king's bedroom, surrounded by swans carved, embroidered, and cast in silver, Ludwig sleeps in a canopied bed that cost more than most Bavarian workers earned in a lifetime. The blue silk curtains, the oak paneling, the marble floors, the silver washstand. Each element represents weeks or months of skilled labor, materials imported from across Europe, and a vision of royal life as aesthetic perfection. But in the offices of the Bavarian Finance Ministry in Munich, clerks compile lists of unpaid contractors, overdue loan installments, and suppliers threatening legal action. The curtains and the ledgers exist in the same kingdom but inhabit incompatible realities. By 1884, some creditors were losing patience. Craftsmen who worked on the palace interiors submit petitions demanding payment for work completed years earlier. Suppliers of marble, silk, and decorative metalwork threaten lawsuits. Foreign banks that extended credit begin to question whether their loans will be repaid. The situation is not yet a catastrophe, but it is approaching a crisis. If Ludwig cannot or will not reduce spending, if no new source of income can be found, the financial structure will collapse, and with it, possibly, the political stability of Bavaria itself. The Bavarian cabinet begins to discuss options. One possibility is to persuade Ludwig to abdicate voluntarily in favor of his younger brother Otto. But Otto has been declared mentally ill and is living in seclusion under medical supervision. He cannot take the throne. Another possibility is to establish a regency, with Ludwig remaining king in name while a regent assumes actual authority. But this would require legal grounds, evidence that the king is unable to fulfill his constitutional duties. A third, more drastic option begins to be discussed quietly among a small circle of ministers, a formal declaration of incapacity, removing Ludwig from power entirely on the grounds that he is mentally unfit to rule. This last option is fraught with constitutional and political difficulty. Bavaria is a monarchy where the king's authority, though limited by a written constitution, still carries symbolic and practical weight. To depose a king requires not just political will, but a legal and medical justification that will withstand scrutiny. The ministers are not physicians. They cannot diagnose mental illness. They need expert opinion, a medical report that will provide the legal cover for what is essentially a political action. The decision to pursue this path is made gradually, without a single defining moment. By early 1885, key ministers, including Johann von Lutz, the head of the cabinet, were consulting with psychiatrists about the possibility of obtaining a medical opinion on the king's mental state. The inquiry is conducted quietly, without Ludwig's knowledge. What begins as a financial problem is being reframed as a psychiatric one, not because the ministers are necessarily convinced of Ludwig's insanity, but because mental incapacity provides the only legal mechanism available to remove a reigning monarch. Neuschwanstein did not bankrupt Bavaria, but it nearly bankrupted its king, and with him the idea of a sovereign Bavarian monarch. The palace stands on its ridge, its white walls glowing against the dark forests, its towers rising toward the alpine sky. Inside, the throne hall's gold mosaics catch the light from the great chandelier. The singers' hall's painted legends watch over an empty floor. The swan-shaped washstand in the king's bedroom continues to supply water from its hidden reservoir, a small miracle of 19th-century plumbing serving a king who understands himself as medieval. But the financial machinery that made these spaces possible is failing. The beauty remains for now. The balance sheets tell a different story. When Ludwig refused to stop building, his ministers began building a case against him instead. Bavaria, in the 1870s and 1880s, existed in a state of constitutional ambiguity. Following the wars of German unification, Prussia's decisive victories over Austria in 1866, and France in 1870-71, the German Empire was proclaimed in January 1871 at Versailles, with the King of Prussia becoming German Emperor. Bavaria, despite maintaining nominal independence and retaining its own king, parliament, and administration, is now a federal state within this larger empire. The diplomatic and military decisions that matter most are increasingly made in Berlin, not Munich. Ludwig II is still called King of Bavaria, but the substance of sovereignty has been quietly transferred to structures he neither controls nor comprehends. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor who orchestrated German unification, understood the delicate politics of bringing Bavaria into the fold. He offered generous terms. Bavaria would retain control over its railways, postal service, and army in peacetime, maintaining more autonomy than other German states. Bavaria would have a seat in the Bundesrat, the Federal Council, and its votes would carry weight in imperial legislation. But on questions of war, foreign policy, and Germany's relationship with other European powers, authority rested with the Kaiser and the imperial government in Berlin. Bavarian independence was preserved in form, while being hollowed out in fact. Ludwig, who took little interest in the details of constitutional governance, did not fully grasp what had been lost, or perhaps he grasped it too well and chose architecture as his response. In an empire where real political power flowed through parliaments, ministries, and military general staffs, Ludwig retreated into a world where power could still be expressed through aesthetic grandeur and personal will. If he could not rule Bavaria in any meaningful political sense, he could at least build palaces that embodied his vision of what kingship should be: absolute, sacred, and unconstrained by parliamentary oversight or budgetary limitations. Neuschwanstein, perched on its ridge near the Austrian border, can be read as an architectural statement about Bavaria's position. The castle looks south and east toward the Alps and Austria, not north toward Prussia and Berlin. Its medieval aesthetic deliberately rejects the values of the new German Empire: industrial efficiency, military discipline, bureaucratic rationality. Where Berlin built railway stations and parade grounds, Ludwig built a fantasy fortress dedicated to Wagner's music dramas and medieval legends. The contrast was not accidental. It was a form of refusal, a declaration that Bavaria could still cultivate beauty, myth, and spiritual depth even as it was absorbed into a larger political structure that cared for none of these things. But the refusal had costs. By the mid-1880s, Ludwig's financial difficulties were becoming public knowledge. Newspapers in Munich and beyond reported on the king's debts, his nocturnal habits, his avoidance of official duties. Illustrated periodicals published engravings of Neuschwanstein and Ludwig's other palaces, sometimes admiringly but increasingly with an undertone of criticism. The castle was described as the work of a Märchenkönig, a fairy tale king, a phrase that could be read as either affectionate or mocking depending on context. The image circulating through print media showed a building of extraordinary beauty and a king whose relationship to reality seemed increasingly tenuous. Political opinion divided. Some saw Ludwig as an embarrassment, a monarch who spent millions on private fantasies while avoiding the constitutional responsibilities of his office. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a sensitive soul trapped in a role he was never equipped to fill, building beautiful spaces as a form of psychological survival. Still others saw him as a legitimate target for removal, a king whose eccentricities and debts had become a liability to Bavaria's reputation and stability within the new German order. Bismarck himself took an interest in the matter, though his role was complicated by the fact that Bavaria's internal affairs were technically beyond his authority as imperial chancellor. When he later read the medical report used to justify Ludwig's deposition, he reportedly expressed skepticism about the diagnosis, recognizing it as a political document masquerading as medical science. But he did not intervene to prevent the king's removal. From Berlin's perspective, a stable Bavaria with effective governance mattered more than the fate of an eccentric monarch who built castles instead of attending to affairs of state. The cultural meaning of Neuschwanstein shifted during these years. In the 1870s, during the early stages of construction, the palace was known primarily within Bavaria and among a small circle of Wagner enthusiasts. By the mid-1880s, it had become a symbol recognized across Germany and beyond, a symbol whose meaning was contested. For some, it represented German Romanesque, the artistic and spiritual values that modernity threatened to erase. For others, it represented royal excess, the waste of resources on private indulgence, while ordinary Bavarians struggled with the economic dislocations of industrialization. The architecture itself seemed to embody this ambivalence, The white limestone walls glowing against the Alps created an image of extraordinary beauty, almost impossible to resist. Travelers who glimpsed the castle from the valley below often described it as otherworldly, a vision from a fairy tale. But closer inspection revealed the contradictions. The medieval appearance built with modern technology, the defensive towers that defended nothing, the throne hall without a throne, the vast spaces designed for courts and ceremonies that never occurred. The building was magnificent and hollow, beautiful and dysfunctional, a monument to a vision of kingship that no longer had any purchase in reality. The café conversations in Munich, the smell of printer's ink on newspaper pages, the murmur of debate in the Bavarian parliament, these were the spaces where Neuschwanstein's meaning was contested and defined. The castle itself stood silent on its ridge, indifferent to interpretation, but its existence had become a political fact, a problem that required resolution. Ludwig had built a fortress for a kind of kingship that no longer existed, surrounding himself with railways and constitutions, with walls designed to keep the modern world at bay. His ministers would soon argue that the king's castles proved not his taste, but his madness, an argument that, however dubious its medical basis, would succeed in its political purpose. In the winter months of 1885-86, Ludwig II moves between his palaces, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, like an actor changing stages between performances. He travels mostly at night, his carriages departing after dark and arriving before dawn. Servants at each palace learn to prepare for his arrival on short notice, lighting fires in unheated rooms, arranging meals to be served at unconventional hours, standing ready in case he summons them, but knowing he most likely will not. The king's presence is marked not by ceremony or conversation, but by absence, by the rooms he occupies alone, the corridors he walks in silence, the elaborate spaces he inhabits as if they were cells. At Neuschwanstein, his preferred routine becomes predictable. He arrives late in the evening and immediately retreats to his private apartments. Dinner is served after midnight in the small dining room adjacent to his bedroom, though he often eats little. After the meal, he dismisses the servants and wanders the palace alone. Sometimes he spends hours in the singers' hall, pacing its length, his footsteps echoing under the carved wooden ceiling. The painted scenes from Parsifal and Tannhäuser watch him from the walls. Grail knights, swan maidens, medieval singers gathered in contest, figures frozen in narrative tableau while their viewer moves restlessly below. The king's living quarters include a swan corner, a small sitting area in his bedroom suite, furnished entirely with objects bearing the swan motif. The chairs are upholstered in fabric embroidered with swans. The side tables feature swan-shaped legs. Even the inkwell on the writing desk is cast in the form of a swan, its neck curved gracefully, its body hollow to hold ink. Surrounded by these objects, Ludwig writes letters, reads, and occasionally composes poetry of no particular distinction. The swan imagery is not merely decorative, it is identity made visible, a constant reminder of the role he has assigned himself in the drama of his own life. Servants who interact with Ludwig during this period later provide testimony that will be incorporated into the medical report used to justify his deposition. They describe a man who keeps irregular hours, who eats erratically, who sometimes speaks to himself or to imaginary persons, who issues contradictory orders and then becomes angry when they are not followed. They describe violent mood swings, periods of grandiose enthusiasm followed by days of withdrawn silence. They describe a king who seems increasingly disconnected from practical reality, obsessed with his building projects, but unable to manage the financial consequences, demanding architectural perfection while creditors gather at the gates. These testimonies must be read carefully. They are collected not by neutral observers, but by officials seeking grounds for the king's removal. The servants who provide them are questioned in ways designed to elicit evidence of mental disturbance. Their observations are filtered through the expectations and prejudices of the physicians conducting the inquiry. Ludwig's nocturnal habits, for instance, are recorded as signs of disorder, though many artists, composers, and writers have worked primarily at night without being diagnosed as insane. His solitary walks through the palace are described as paranoid behavior. though a person might simply prefer solitude without being mentally ill. The irregular meals, the sudden mood changes, the talking to himself, all of these might be symptoms of distress, isolation, or depression rather than of the advanced mental disturbance the medical report will claim to identify. The physician who will sign his name to the diagnosis is Bernhard von Gudden, director of the Munich District Asylum for the Insane and a prominent figure in German psychiatry. Gudden is known for his anatomical studies of the brain and for his conviction that mental illness can be identified through careful observation of behavior. He has never met Ludwig II. He has never examined him. He has never spoken to him. The medical opinion he provides is based entirely on testimony collected from servants, courtiers, and officials, testimony gathered specifically for the purpose of building a case for incapacity. Modern psychiatric scholarship has questioned the diagnosis extensively. The behaviors described in the audio testimonies are not sufficient to support a conclusion of severe mental illness by contemporary diagnostic standards. Some historians have suggested that Ludwig may have suffered from depression or a related mood disorder, conditions that would not necessarily impair his ability to rule. Others have argued that his eccentricities, while real, were amplified and reinterpreted through the lens of political necessity, that the diagnosis was constructed to justify a predetermined conclusion. The question of Ludwig's actual mental state remains unresolved and perhaps unresolvable given the nature of the surviving evidence. What is clear is that architecture has become the stage for a life lived increasingly at odds with constitutional expectations. The throne hall, designed as a space of sacred majesty, stands empty because Ludwig cannot or will not perform the public rituals of kingship that would give it purpose. The Singers' Hall, designed for gatherings of artists and musicians, echoes with the footsteps of a solitary figure, because Ludwig has withdrawn from the social world that such gatherings require. Even the king's bedroom, the most private space in the palace, is furnished not for rest, but for performance. The swan motifs creating a theatrical environment in which Ludwig enacts his identification with the legendary knight of Wagner's opera. The telephone receiver in his apartments allows him to speak to officials in the valley without leaving his rooms. The electric bell system allows him to summon servants without face-to-face contact. The layout of the palace itself, with its long corridors and isolated royal suite, enables a form of life where human interaction can be minimized to near invisibility. Technology serves isolation. Architecture enables withdrawal. The palace that was meant to be a refuge has become, in some sense, a trap, not because it confines Ludwig physically, but because it allows him to retreat so completely from the world beyond its walls that re-entry becomes increasingly difficult. The flicker of candlelight on blue silk curtains, the soft click of a telephone receiver being lifted, the distant toll of church bells from the valley far below. These are the sensory markers of Ludwig's existence at Neuschwanstein in the months before June 1886. The castle had been designed to hold a court. Instead, it held its solitary builder, a man who had spent millions to create spaces for rituals that existed only in imagination, and who now found himself alone with walls that reflected his dreams but could not sustain them. In June 1886, others would arrive at its gate with a different script for his final act. On the morning of 8th June 1886, 4 psychiatrists signed a document titled Ärztliches Gutachten über den Geisteszustand Senior Majestät des Königs Ludwig II. Von Bayern, Medical Report on the Mental Condition of His Majesty King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The report, primarily authored by Bernhard von Gudden, declares the king to be suffering from paranoia and mental disturbance to a very advanced degree, rendering him permanently incapable of exercising royal authority. The diagnosis is based entirely on second-hand testimony. None of the physicians have examined Ludwig or spoken with him. The report is not a scientific document, but a political instrument, providing the legal justification for a decision already made by the Bavarian cabinet under the leadership of Johann von Lutz. The constitutional mechanism is established. A commission is formed to travel to Neuschwanstein, present the medical report to the king, inform him of his deposition, and escort him to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg, where he will be placed under medical supervision. The commission includes Gooden himself, several court officials, and an armed police escort. They departed Munich on 9 June with instructions to act quickly and decisively. Ludwig is to be removed from Neuschwanstein and transferred to Berg before news of the deposition can spread and before the king can mount any organized resistance. The commission arrived at Hohenschwangau on the night of 9 June and prepared to ascend to Neuschwanstein the following morning. But the plan encounters immediate difficulty. Word of the commission's arrival reaches the castle before dawn on 10 June. Ludwig is informed that officials carrying a medical report have come to depose him. His response is swift and defiant. He orders the castle gates closed and the access bridge over the Polet Gorge raised. He summons the local police commander and demands protection against what he characterizes as an illegal kidnapping attempt. He sends messages to supporters in the valley, calling for resistance. The commission approaches the castle in the early morning fog. The gatehouse, built of red sandstone with narrow windows evoking medieval arrow slits, stands closed against them. The courtyard beyond, where foundations for the planned central keep lie open and unfinished, is inaccessible. Local police, loyal to the king rather than to the Munich government, block the path. A local noblewoman, Baroness Spera von Truchsess, confronts the commissioners, declaring the deposition illegal and threatening to mobilize local resistance. For several hours, the standoff continues, the commotion at the gate, Ludwig inside the palace, and the alpine fog rendering the entire scene dreamlike and uncertain. The architectural setting is crucial. Neuschwanstein was designed as a fortress, and though its defensive features are purely aesthetic, the arrow slits are too narrow for actual weapons, the towers contain no military apparatus, the isolated location and single point of access make the castle genuinely difficult to approach against resistance. The steep path from Hohenschwangau can be easily blocked. The bridge over the Polet Gorge can be raised. The gatehouse, though decorative, is still a barrier. The hill that Ludwig chose for its romantic remoteness now serves, briefly, as actual defense. By afternoon, the commission retreated to Hohenschwangau to regroup. The first attempt to seize the king has failed, but the political machinery in Munich is already moving forward. Prince Luitpold, Ludwig's uncle, is proclaimed regent that same day, assuming royal authority while Ludwig's status remains in legal limbo. The cabinet issues statements declaring the king unfit to rule. Newspapers in Munich and Berlin report the deposition as an accomplished fact, though Ludwig himself remains free and defiant in his castle on the ridge. The second attempt is planned for the night of 11 to 12 June. This time, the commission includes a larger police force and clear orders to use whatever means necessary to secure the king. They will not approach through the main gate, but will attempt entry through service entrances or, if necessary, force the doors. Resistance will be overcome. Ludwig will be taken. The castle gate on the night of 11 June is lit by torches, their flames flickering in the mountain wind. The fog that often envelops Neuschwanstein has returned, clinging to the white limestone walls, obscuring the towers, reducing visibility to a few meters. Inside, Ludwig knows what is coming. He drafts letters to foreign monarchs seeking intervention. He instructs servants to prepare for a siege. He moves through the half-finished palace, the throne hall with its empty dais, the singer's hall with its painted legends, the bedroom with its swan-shaped washstand, aware that these spaces he has spent 17 years creating will not protect him. Shortly after midnight on 12th June, the commission succeeds in entering the castle. The precise details of the confrontation are disputed in surviving accounts. Some sources describe Ludwig attempting to flee through back corridors. Others describe him in his bedroom, refusing to leave, surrounded by servants. What is clear is that he is eventually subdued, not through violence, but through a combination of police presence and the exhaustion of his options. He is formally arrested, though the word arrested is not used in official documents, and informed that he will be taken immediately to Berg Castle. The departure from Neuschwanstein occurs before dawn on 12th June. Ludwig, accompanied by Gooden and the police escort, descends the steep path to Hohenschwangau in darkness. Carriages wait below to transport him to Burg, a small palace on Lake Starnberg that will serve as his prison. The journey takes several hours. Ludwig sits silent in the carriage, staring out at the Bavarian landscape, fields, forests, villages, that he is seeing for the last time as a free man. The hill that had once kept invaders at a distance now kept its own king from reaching his people. Neuschwanstein had been designed as an escape from the world, a refuge where Ludwig could live according to his own vision of kingship. But the architectural isolation that made the castle a sanctuary also made it a trap. Once the political decision was made to remove him, the remoteness of the location worked against him. There were no crowds to appeal to, no nearby supporters to mobilize, no escape routes except the single path descending through the valley. The castle's beauty, its romantic situation, its carefully designed aesthetic of medieval refuge, all of these became irrelevant in the face of armed men with legal documents and political authority. On 13 June 1886, one day after his arrival at Burg Castle, Ludwig II was found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg, along with Dr. Gooden. The circumstances remain disputed. Suicide, accident, murder, or some combination have all been proposed. The official investigation concludes drowning, but leaves many questions unresolved. 3 days later, there would be no king left to inhabit the dream he built. The swan-shaped washstand in Neuschwanstein's royal bedroom stands empty, its silver surface reflecting only the gray alpine light filtering through windows that will not see their builder again. On the evening of 13th June 1886, the bodies of Ludwig II and Bernhard von Gooden were recovered from Lake Starnberg. They are found in shallow water, less than a meter deep near the shore of Burg Castle's grounds. Gooden's body shows signs of struggle, scratches on his face, torn clothing, suggesting physical confrontation. Ludwig's body is unmarked. The official cause of death for both is listed as drowning. No satisfactory explanation is offered for why an experienced swimmer like Ludwig would drown in such shallow water, or how Gooden, sent to prevent exactly this outcome, failed to stop it. The death became a national scandal and an international mystery. Newspapers across Europe report the story with varying degrees of accuracy and speculation. Some accounts describe a suicide pact. Others suggest Ludwig murdered Gooden and then drowned himself. Still others hint at a broader conspiracy, that Ludwig was killed to prevent his escape, or to silence him, or to ensure that the regency established under Prince Luitpold could not be challenged. The Bavarian government conducts an investigation, but the report is brief, inconclusive, and leaves the central questions unanswered. Modern scholarship has not resolved the mystery. No definitive evidence exists to prove suicide, murder, or accident. The most that can be said with certainty is that Ludwig died in circumstances that remain ambiguous, that the official investigation was cursory, and that the political convenience of his death, occurring just as legal challenges to the regency might have begun, raises questions that cannot now be answered. The mystery has become part of the story, adding another layer of darkness to the already troubled narrative of the Märchenkönig and his fairy tale castles. Within weeks of Ludwig's death, the Bavarian government faced the practical question of what to do with Neuschwanstein. The palace is incomplete, with roughly 14 to 15 rooms finished and more than 150 rooms existing only as brick shells or empty space. The construction costs 6.2 million marks by the most reliable archival count, represent an enormous investment that has generated no return and served no public purpose. The king's death leaves the project frozen in time, half realized, a monument to ambition that will never be completed according to its original vision. The decision is made quickly. Neuschwanstein will be open to paying visitors. The Bavarian Ministry of Finance and the palace administration recognize that the castle, despite being unfinished, has already become famous through newspaper reports and illustrated periodicals. The romantic silhouette, the dramatic mountain setting, and the tragic story of its builder create a compelling narrative that might be monetized. On 1st August 1886, 7 weeks after Ludwig's death, Neuschwanstein opened to the public as a museum. The first visitors enter through the gatehouse, climb the stairs to the third floor, and are guided through the completed rooms. They see the throne hall without a throne, its Byzantine mosaics glowing in the light from high windows, its floor paved in millions of tiles arranged in geometric patterns, its apse empty where the symbol of kingship was meant to stand. They see the Singers' Hall, its walls painted with scenes from Parsifal and Tannhäuser, its wooden ceiling carved in elaborate detail, its vast space silent and unused. They see the king's bedroom, the blue silk curtains embroidered with lions and swans, the carved oak paneling depicting scenes from Tristan, and the silver-plated swan-shaped washstand that has already become the most photographed object in the palace. The contrast between the completed rooms and the unfinished sections is stark. Guided tours follow a fixed route through the inhabited spaces, but behind closed doors lie corridors of raw brick, rooms that exist only as structural shells, and the empty courtyard where the central keep was never built. The palace is simultaneously a masterpiece and a ruin, finished enough to awe visitors with its decorative richness, incomplete enough to reveal the gap between vision and realization. The financial logic is straightforward. The entrance fees will help offset the debts Ludwig accumulated. The Bavarian government hopes to recover at least part of the construction costs through sustained tourism revenue. Early visitor numbers are modest, a few hundred per week in the first months, but they grow steadily as word spreads and as railway connections to Füssen improve. The palace that was designed as the most private of royal retreats becomes a public attraction, its intimacy violated by necessity, its solitude replaced by the murmur of tour groups moving through rooms that were meant for one person. The sensory experience of the palace changes immediately. The silence Ludwig cultivated, the empty corridors, the unattended throne hall, the bedroom where only the king slept, is replaced by the sound of footsteps on marble floors, the rustle of ticket stubs being torn, the voices of guides explaining the iconography of the painted murals. The smell of beeswax and fresh paint is joined by the odor of wool coats and damp umbrellas, the subtle evidence of hundreds of visitors moving through spaces designed for aristocratic ceremony. The echoes in the Singers' Hall, once carrying only the king's solitary footsteps, now carry the accumulated murmur of tourists from across Europe. Photographs from the late 1880s show Neuschwanstein already assuming its role as a spectacle. Professional photographers set up cameras on the slopes below the castle, capturing the silhouette against the Alps, selling prints to visitors as souvenirs. The image begins to circulate beyond Bavaria, in German illustrated magazines, in travel guides, in postcards. The castle that Ludwig built to escape the gaze of the modern world becomes one of the most photographed buildings in Europe. The transformation is total and immediate. 7 weeks separate Ludwig's death from the castle's opening as a museum. In that brief interval, Neuschwanstein shifts from private obsession to public commodity. The swan-shaped washstand, once a personal symbol known only to the king and his servants, becomes an object displayed behind barriers for visitors who photograph it, sketch it, and discuss its aesthetic merits. The painted legends on the walls, once contemplated in solitude, are now explained by guides reading from prepared scripts. The throne hall, designed to embody sacred kingship, becomes a space where tourists gather and gaze upward at mosaics whose meaning has become historical rather than living. In the photographs, Ludwig still gazes from balconies as a lonely sovereign, his image preserved in the official portraits that hang in the palace. But in reality, his palace had already become something else, a museum, a monument, a machine for generating revenue and managing debt. The building survived its builder by only weeks before being repurposed for ends he would have found intolerable. The narrative he tried to create through architecture, a story of kingship as sacred art, of beauty as refuge, of swans and legends standing against modernity, was already being overwritten by a different story. The story of tourism, of public access, of a fairy tale castle that would welcome not knights and grail kings but over 60 million visitors in the century to come. Each walking through a residence its builder barely used, each contributing a small sum toward paying off debts accumulated in pursuit of a dream that could not survive its dreamer. During the Second World War, Neuschwanstein's isolation made it valuable for purposes Ludwig never imagined. In 1944, as Allied bombing raids devastate German cities and as the Nazi regime faces military collapse on multiple fronts, officials of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the agency responsible for looting art from occupied territories, select Neuschwanstein as a storage depot for stolen artworks from France. The castle's location in southern Bavaria, distant from major industrial centers and protected by the surrounding Alps, makes it relatively safe from aerial bombardment. Its vast spaces, including the many rooms that remain unfinished since Ludwig's death, provide storage capacity for thousands of objects. Beginning in the autumn of 1944, trucks arrived at Hohenschwangau carrying crates of paintings, sculptures, furniture, and archival documents seized from Jewish collectors, museums, and private homes in France. The crates are hauled up the steep path to Neuschwanstein and stacked in rooms throughout the palace. The Singers' Hall, designed for Wagnerian performances and never used for them, becomes a warehouse for catalogued artworks awaiting transport to other locations or incorporation into Nazi collections. Temporary rails are laid in some corridors to facilitate movement of heavy crates. The painted legends on the walls, Parsifal, Tannhäuser, Lohengrin, watch over this transformation from tourist attraction to art depot. The operation is methodical. Each crate is numbered and logged. Inventories are compiled detailing the contents and their provenance. Photographs document the storage arrangements. The Einsatzstab operates with bureaucratic precision, treating the looting of European cultural heritage as an administrative task requiring careful record-keeping. Neuschwanstein becomes one node in a network of storage sites across Germany and Austria, where stolen art is hidden from Allied advance. The liberation of the castle occurred in May 1945, shortly after Germany's surrender. American forces enter Neuschwanstein and discover the depot. What they find is both tragic and extraordinary. Thousands of artworks stolen from their rightful owners, stored in a 19th century fantasy castle that was itself a kind of historical forgery. The irony is noted by some of the Allied art specialists, a palace built to evoke an imaginary medieval past, serving as storage for art stolen during a genocidal present. The recovery operation takes months. Specialists from the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, the Monuments Men, catalog the stored artworks, identify their provenance where possible, and arrange for their return to France. Among the materials recovered are 39 photograph albums documenting Nazi art seizures, invaluable evidence for post-war restitution efforts. The albums contain images of paintings, furniture, and other objects in the homes and collections from which they were taken, providing a record that will help families and institutions recover stolen property. The work is careful and slow. Each crate must be opened, its contents examined and documented, its provenance researched. The paintings and sculptures must be protected from damage during examination and transport. The space itself, a palace designed for aesthetic contemplation and now filled with evidence of systematic theft, creates a strange context for the recovery work. Art specialists write reports describing the surreal experience of cataloging stolen Impressionist paintings in a room whose walls are decorated with Germanic legends, documenting looted Jewish collections in a castle built by a king obsessed with medieval Christian mythology. By late 1945, most of the stored art had been returned to France or transferred to other Allied collection points. The castle, its rooms now empty again, reopens to visitors. The post-war years bring a different kind of tourist. American soldiers stationed in Germany, displaced persons passing through Bavaria, and gradually, as Europe begins to recover, the return of middle-class tourism. The numbers remain modest through the late 1940s and 1950s, but they grow steadily. By the 1960s, Neuschwanstein was attracting more than 500,000 visitors per year. The 1970s and 80s bring new challenges. The palace administration notices cracks appearing in the limestone facades. The rock beneath the courtyard, where the central keep was never built, is shifting slightly, placing stress on the foundations of the surrounding structures. Engineers conduct surveys and discover that the natural stone of the ridge is more unstable than 19th century builders realized. The castle is slowly moving, millimeters per year, but enough to require intervention. A major restoration program begins in the 1980s and continues into the 21st century. Cracked limestone blocks are removed and replaced with new stone cut from the same quarries used in the original construction. Steel reinforcements are added to critical structural points. The foundation under the courtyard is stabilized with modern engineering techniques. Scaffolding appears and disappears on the facades for years at a time, sections of the castle hidden behind protective barriers while masons work. The swan-shaped washstand in the king's bedroom undergoes its own preservation. The silver plating, originally bright, has tarnished over decades. Conservators debate whether to clean it to its original appearance or preserve the patina as historical evidence. They choose a middle path, careful cleaning to prevent further deterioration, but retention of some age-related darkening to maintain authenticity. The washstand behind its barrier is polished according to schedules logged in preservation reports, its surface maintained in a state of controlled aging. The tourist infrastructure expands to match growing visitor numbers. By the late 20th century, Neuschwanstein welcomed more than 1 million visitors annually, requiring sophisticated crowd management systems. Timed entry tickets are introduced. Tour groups are limited in size and duration. Audio guides in multiple languages replace human guides in some contexts. The click of camera shutters became the dominant sound in the Singers' Hall and Throne Hall, though photography was later restricted in certain rooms to reduce light damage to 19th century textiles and painted surfaces. The village of Hohenschwangau below the castle transforms into a tourist economy. Hotels, restaurants, and souvenir shops line the approach road. Buses arrive by the dozens each day during peak season, disgorging crowds who climb the path to the gatehouse or ride horse-drawn carriages partway up. Parking lots are expanded multiple times. A new ticket center is built at the base of the hill to manage the crowds. The medieval bridge over the Paulet Gorge, Maria Bridge, becomes a popular photography point, offering the canonical view of Neuschwanstein's silhouette against the Alps. The castle survives wars that destroyed older, more functional castles, not because it was useful, but because it was picturesque. Its remoteness protected it from strategic bombing during World War II. Its aesthetic appeal protected it from demolition in the economic hardships of the post-war years, where genuine medieval fortresses were allowed to crumble or were deliberately destroyed. Neuschwanstein was preserved, maintained, and gradually restored, because it looked like what people expected a castle to look like. The 19th century fantasy proved more durable than many medieval realities. Its greatest vulnerability now is not artillery, but admiration. The slow erosion caused by millions of feet, millions of camera flashes, millions of breaths exhaling humidity into spaces designed for one person's solitude. The announcement comes on 25th of July 2025. During a UNESCO World Heritage Committee meeting. 4 of Ludwig II's palaces, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, and the small hunting lodge Schaken, are inscribed together as a World Heritage Site, recognized for their outstanding universal value as examples of 19th century Romantic architecture and as expressions of a unique vision of kingship. Bavarian State Premier Markus Söder celebrates the decision, describing the palaces as symbols of Bavarian identity and cultural achievement. The inscription secures international protection and brings prestige, but it also confirms Neuschwanstein's transformation from private refuge to global patrimony. The UNESCO dossier, prepared over several years, emphasizes the palace's architectural significance, their integration of art and landscape, and their influence on later castle design worldwide. It notes Neuschwanstein's role in popularizing neo-Romanesque architecture and its impact on fantasy castle imagery in film, literature, and theme parks. The document carefully frames Ludwig's projects not as follies, but as coherent expressions of 19th century Romanticism, deliberate attempts to create Gesamtkunstwerke, total artworks, where architecture, decoration, landscape, and meaning formed unified wholes. The inscription process requires commitment to preservation standards that the Bavarian Palace administration already meets, but now must maintain under international scrutiny. Visitor management becomes a formal concern within the World Heritage Framework. The challenge is balancing public access with conservation, allowing people to experience spaces that were never designed for mass visitation while preventing the damage that such visitation inevitably causes. By 2025, Neuschwanstein receives approximately 1.4 to 1.5 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited castles in Europe. The numbers strain the infrastructure despite decades of careful planning. During peak summer months, the castle can welcome 6,000 visitors in a single day, each person purchasing a timed entry ticket, each ticket corresponding to a specific tour group, each group allowed precisely 30 to 35 minutes inside. The throughput is industrial in its precision, though the language used to describe it emphasizes cultural experience and heritage access. The visitor experience in 2025 is mediated by multiple layers of technology and interpretation. Audio guides provide narration in more than a dozen languages, delivering synchronized commentary as tour groups move through the completed rooms. The guides explain the throne hall's Byzantine mosaics, identify the scenes depicted in the Singers' Hall murals, and point out the swan motifs in the king's bedroom. The script emphasizes aesthetic achievement and romantic vision, mentioning Ludwig's financial difficulties and political troubles, but framing them as context rather than critique. The spaces themselves exist in a state of preservation that would be unrecognizable to Ludwig. Climate control systems maintain temperature and humidity within narrow ranges to protect 19th-century textiles and painted surfaces. Barriers keep visitors from touching carved woodwork or leaning against decorated walls. Lighting is carefully calibrated to allow visibility while minimizing damage from ultraviolet radiation. The marble floors, walked on by millions of people over nearly 14 decades, are periodically refinished. The swan-shaped washstand in the king's bedroom sits behind its barrier, its surface polished according to preservation schedules, museum-quality labels explaining its symbolism and craftsmanship. Outside the inhabited rooms, the unfinished sections remain largely inaccessible to tourists. The rooms that exist only as brick shells, the corridors that were never decorated, the spaces where Ludwig's vision was interrupted by death and financial reality. These areas are closed off, used occasionally for storage or palace administration, but not integrated into the tour route. The incompleteness that was so visible to early visitors has been hidden, the narrative streamlined to focus on what was finished rather than what was abandoned. The courtyard where the central keep was never built remains open to the sky. The foundation lines are still visible in the paving stones, a ghostly outline of what might have been. Tour guides sometimes point out this absence, explaining that Ludwig ran out of time and money before the tallest tower could be constructed. The observation is factual but carries an undertone of melancholy, the incompleteness serving as a reminder that ambition, no matter how grand, cannot escape the constraints of economics and mortality. The cultural meaning of Neuschwanstein in the early 21st century is layered and sometimes contradictory. For many visitors, the castle represents fairy tale romance, its image familiar from countless reproductions, films, and theme park adaptations. The Disney castle, with its similar silhouette and colorful turrets, has made Neuschwanstein's outline instantly recognizable worldwide, though most people who recognize it could not name it or locate it on a map. The building functions as a generic symbol, castle as such, more than as a specific historical place. For others, particularly those who learn its history, Neuschwanstein represents tragic romanticism, the story of a sensitive king destroyed by the political and financial realities of modernity. This narrative has its own romantic appeal, positioning Ludwig as a martyr to beauty, a figure who refused compromise and paid the ultimate price. The story is compelling but risks sentimentalizing what was also a story of governmental paralysis, unpaid debts, and a constitutional system struggling to remove a ruler who could not or would not fulfill basic duties. For Bavarian politicians and cultural administrators, Neuschwanstein is an economic engine and identity marker. The castle generates significant tourism revenue directly through entrance fees and indirectly through the hotels, restaurants, and services that cluster around it. It appears in marketing materials for Bavaria, for Germany, for European heritage tourism. It represents a usable past, a building whose troubled history can be acknowledged while its aesthetic power and economic utility are emphasized. For preservationists and architectural historians, Neuschwanstein is a conservation challenge and a case study in 19th-century historicism. The technical problems of maintaining a building perched on unstable rock, the ethical questions of how to manage high-volume tourism in fragile historical spaces, the scholarly debates about how to interpret Ludwig's projects, these concern a smaller audience but shape the policies that govern the castle's future. The murmur of multilingual audio guides, the rhythmic beep of ticket scanners at the entrance, the soft hiss of climate control systems working to protect the 19th-century decor. These are the sounds of Neuschwanstein in 2025. The throne hall's gold mosaics still catch the light from the great chandelier, but the light is now LED, precisely calibrated for conservation. The Singers' Hall's painted legends still watch over the space, but they watch over a constant stream of tourists rather than the solitary king who commissioned them. The swan-shaped washstand in the royal bedroom still stands where it was placed in the 1880s, but now it stands as a museum object, its symbolism explained on labels, its surface photographed by millions. What began as a private refusal of the modern world has become one of its most reproduced images. The irony is complete. The castle built to escape industrialization and mass culture has become an icon of both, its image mechanically reproduced on postcards, posters, calendars, and screens. The question now is not whether Neuschwanstein will survive, but what, exactly, it is preserving. Architectural fabric, certainly, but also a story about ambition and impermanence, beauty and delusion, the dream of permanence confronting the reality of time. The king's bedroom in Neuschwanstein, early on a morning in 2025, is empty of tourists for perhaps 20 minutes before the first guided group of the day arrives. During this brief interval, a palace employee enters to perform routine checks, examining the climate control readings, ensuring the barriers are properly positioned, noting any visible changes in the condition of textiles or woodwork. The morning light enters through the tall windows, the same windows through which light entered on 13th of June 1886, though the glass is now different, replaced multiple times over nearly a century and a half, and the world outside is louder with road traffic and tour buses. The swan-shaped washstand stands in its accustomed place against the wall. The silver plating, maintained according to preservation schedules logged in conservation databases, reflects the morning light much as it did when it was new, though the shine is carefully controlled, not too bright, not too dull, maintained in a state of museological perfection that Ludwig himself never experienced. The washstand no longer supplies water. The hidden reservoir is empty, the mechanism disconnected decades ago to prevent leaks that might damage the marble floor or the wooden paneling below. It is now a sculptural object, its function remembered rather than performed. The room itself exists in a state of permanent maintenance. The oak paneling carved with scenes from the Tristan legend is periodically examined for signs of wood rot or insect damage. The blue silk curtains embroidered with lions and swans are protected by UV filtering glass in the windows and by carefully controlled light levels that make photography difficult. The bed, never slept in by tourists but walked past by millions, is dressed in reproduction textiles that approximate the originals, which are stored in climate-controlled archives and examined only by textile conservators wearing white gloves. Every surface in this room has been touched, photographed, studied, and protected. Yet the touch is controlled, the photography regulated, the study documented, the protection professionalized. What was once the most intimate space in a palace designed for intimacy is now among the most public. Its privacy violated not once but continuously, thousands of times per day during peak season. The paradox is that this violation, this transformation from private bedroom to museum exhibit, is what preserves it. If Neuschwanstein had remained private property after Ludwig's death, it would likely have been sold, subdivided, modified, or demolished decades ago. Its survival depends on its publicity. The scholar tracing the swan motif from medieval heraldry through Wagner's operas to Ludwig's obsessive decor, and finally to the modern tourist gaze, finds the bedroom the clearest example of each stage. The swan was first a heraldic device of the Knights of Schwangau, whose ruined castles stood on this ridge before Ludwig cleared them away. It became Wagner's symbol in Lohengrin, the opera that so moved the young crown prince. It became Ludwig's personal symbol, appearing on nearly every surface in his completed rooms, embroidered, carved, cast, painted, a reminder of identity and myth. And finally, it became a museum object and a tourist attraction, photographed more than almost any other decorative detail in the castle, reproduced on souvenirs sold in the village below, recognized by millions who may know nothing else about Ludwig II or his architectural projects. The same morning light that now illuminates the swan washstand for museum visitors once illuminated it for a king who understood himself as living inside a legend. The continuity is real but misleading. The physical object endures. The meaning has transformed entirely. What was a symbol has become a specimen. What was intimate has become public. What was a dream has become documentation. Beyond this bedroom, the rest of Neuschwanstein continues its double existence. The completed rooms function as museum spaces, carefully maintained and continuously monitored. The unfinished sections, the rooms that remain brick shells, the corridors that were never decorated, exist in a different state, closed to tourists, occasionally photographed for architectural scholarship, but largely forgotten in the narrative that guides construct for visitors. The palace is both complete and incomplete, both preserved and still under construction in some conceptual sense, frozen at the moment of Ludwig's death but continually maintained through modern intervention. The structural challenges continue. The rock beneath the courtyard, monitored by engineers since the 1980s, continues its slow movement. The limestone facades, despite repeated restoration, continue to weather. The painted ceilings, despite climate control, continue to age. The textiles, despite UV filters and humidity regulation, continue to fade. Preservation is not stasis, but managed decay, the attempt to put slow, inevitable processes to rates that allow ongoing public access without catastrophic loss. The quiet hum of a dehumidifier in the corner of the king's bedroom, the soft rubber footfall of the palace employee checking conditions before the first tour, the muted chatter of visitors waiting outside the door. These are the sensory markers of Neuschwanstein in its current state. The sounds are low-level, carefully managed, designed not to disturb the impression of historical authenticity that the palace is meant to convey. But they are modern sounds, the acoustic signature of a building that survives only through constant technological intervention. Architectural fact leads to cultural meaning. Neuschwanstein remains unfinished, structurally monitored, continually restored. It is a 19th century attempt to escape industrial modernity that now depends on modern engineering, mass tourism, and international governance to survive. The limestone walls are original, but reinforced with steel. The decorative programs are authentic, but lit by LED and protected by climate control. The swan motifs are 19th century, but photographed by 21st century cameras and reproduced on postcards printed in factories Ludwig could not have imagined. Cultural meaning leads to philosophical consequence. Ludwig sought permanence in stone, in legends painted on walls, in swans carved into every surface. He believed that architecture could arrest time, that myth made solid could outlast history, that beauty could triumph over the compromises and corruptions of ordinary political life. Time answered not with total ruin, the fate of many castles built with more practical purposes, but with transformation. His private myth has become a shared photograph. His refuge has become a carefully managed route. His castle has become a World Heritage Site, protected by international treaty and visited by more people in a single day than saw in Ludwig's entire lifetime. The swan washstand in morning light stands as it has stood for nearly a century and a half. It was meant to last forever, but forever in architecture, rarely survives a century unchanged. The stone still stands above Hohenschwangau, white limestone glowing against the Alps. The towers still rise in their asymmetrical arrangement, pointed arches and crenellated parapets, creating the silhouette that appears on millions of postcards. The swans still gleam in museum light, their silver surfaces carefully maintained, their symbolism carefully explained to visitors who pass through at regulated intervals. What has vanished is the silence for which it was built. The solitude Ludwig created at such cost, the private space where myth could be lived rather than performed, the refuge from newspapers and parliaments and the industrial century. That is what cannot be preserved. The building survives. The dream does not. And perhaps that is the true dark story of Europe's most expensive fairy tale castle. Not that it was built, not that it cost millions, not that its builder was deposed and died mysteriously 3 days later, but that it survived so completely while meaning something entirely different from what it was meant to mean. The swans remain. The silence is gone, and the tourists move through on schedule 21st century visitors to a 19th century fantasy of a 13th century world that never existed except in one man's imagination, now preserved in stone for reasons he would have found incomprehensible.